Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us on our live session today on reopening benchmarks. We have a lot of data to share, so let's get started. I know that when people reopen back to the public, there's this initial excitement around being able to welcome visitors back onto your site, but as soon as that happens, the eyes go to the numbers, to the data, and perhaps there's a little bit of disappointment when you come to this realization and there may not be as many visitors coming through your doors as you initially anticipated. Angie, could you tell us about what our reopening index is and why we decided to put it together?
Yeah, and congratulations to everyone who has reopened. It's a wonderful point in time that we are here finally after months of being at home. If you haven't, hopefully that day isn't too far away for you. But like Cece said, as soon as people do reopen, all eyes are going on those numbers. And unfortunately, they are not going to be the same as what they were before COVID. And so there immediately becomes this question of, is what I'm experiencing normal for these times, and how does it compare with everybody else? And we're seeing all this data rolling in from lots of different venues around the world who are reopening. And so we thought we would form together a bit of a recovery index to give people a sense of is what they are seeing normal. And so how we've decided to do that is we use machine learning to predict how many visitors will come, what they'll do, how much they'll spend, etc. And that machine learning trains itself on historic data. So it looks at what a typical Monday looks like, or a 10 a.m., or what's happening in a winter season, or during a school holiday, or when an event is on, or something like that. And it forecasts forward. And so it gives us an idea of what normal should have been without COVID in place. And then we can compare percent of normal. And so we found that in trying to normalize, if I can use that term, recovery across lots of different venues in different parts of the world, looking at percent of normal is the best metric to compare benchmark, to get that like for like experience. And it helps answer that question of, I'm only doing half or a quarter or whatever the number is of what I normally do. Is that normal?
Awesome. Some really complex tech there. So what does reopening look like?
Well, what we've seen is that for most of our venues, when they reopen, the average percent of normal that they're seeing is about 20% on that first day. It differs slightly based on, or there's quite a big range actually, based on all sorts of things. The main factors are regionally where you are. We've found I hate to say this, but Australia are doing better than New Zealand. So us New Zealanders need to get out there and visit more museums and theme parks. We can't be having that. And then the UK is doing slightly better than the US. So region is definitely a factor in what that first reopening is looking like and how quickly you grow out of it. Another big factor is segment. So particularly where you're in a segment that's heavily tourist exposed, and probably the most tourist exposed businesses are the ones that are booking tourist experiences, especially if those tourist experiences usually have very long lead times in their advanced passes. So if your venue is one where people will go online and book a ticket months ahead or weeks ahead, and you suddenly reopen because maybe you've only been given a few days notice, you'll find that you start in those sort of single digit range, as opposed to some of the free venues who have largely a local audience, especially where they've got particularly outdoor venues like zoos, they can get up into that, which we are seeing sort of start at the 50% mark. It also depends on what your venue is doing, because lots of venues have got different tactics at play at the moment. So some of them are only open to emergency workers or essential workers or members, or they've only opened some of the venue, or they've got capacity limits. So the constraints that you're imposing as a venue, or that you might have imposed on you for legislation in your geography, that will have an effect as well.
And I know that all throughout this time that we were talking about what reopening looks like and what demand there's going to be, there was always sort of two different frames of mind. One where there's going to be pent-up demand in the market and people were looking forward to going back to attractions and visiting all of their favourite places again, or perhaps opposite to that, there's going to be this type of hesitance and perhaps a little bit of fear. What are we seeing when it comes to pent-up demand versus non-pent-up demand?
So I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but we have not seen pent-up demand in any venue that is a visitation-based visitor attraction. And the only place that we have seen it is in venues that are event-based visitor attractions like stadiums, and it has been to do with sports. So all of those sports fans that are sitting at home, who've been watching replays for the last few months, they have got pent-up demand. But unfortunately, people who are visiting their library or going to a gallery or to an aquarium or a theme park, that hasn't been the case. So the average starting point for day one that we're seeing globally is 20%, so not pent-up demand. And it's coming out fairly slowly, so it's not sort of at breakneck speeds that it's suddenly bouncing back. So the unfortunate news is that it's going to be a bit of a slow growth.
We're sorry, everybody. So we now know what reopening looks like in that first perhaps 1 or 2 days, but talk to me about the recovery. What do we know about the days or the weeks following that first reopening day?
Yeah, I think the really positive thing that we are seeing is that in those first few weeks, and our data points are limited to regions that have been open. I mean, in the UK, for example, only a few venues are allowed to open right now, and it'll be July 4 before the bulk of the visitor attractions segment can. In the US, it's very patchy as to who's allowed to open and not, and then Australasia is a little bit better off. What we are seeing is in those first few weeks, that first months, is that recovery does start to occur. So we are seeing week on week that percent of normal is growing, and generally people are putting on somewhere between 5 and 15% of growth in that percent of normal. So not in the absolute figures, but because it's quite easy to get sort of over 100% growth week on week if you've only got a few to start off with. But if we're using that really great recovery index of percent of normal, we're seeing a 5 to 15% uplift in those first few weeks, which is great news. It means if you started at 20% of normal, you could expect to be getting sort of 35% plus by the end of your first month, which is, I think, a nice hope to have once you do open the doors and see only a few visitors on that first day, is to know that there's a recovery to come, and it does come relatively soon.
Very nice. And for New Zealand in particular, we do have quite a lot of data points in New Zealand because many attractions have opened here, if not all. And in the past month, we've changed from what we call level 2 to level 1. How did that change recovery for attractions here?
So I think every country in the world pretty much has got reopening happening in stages, where with each stage different venues are allowed to reopen, and with each stage there's different constraints or reduced constraints on the venues that are open. And in New Zealand, we were allowed to open our visitor attractions at level 2, but they had to be capacity constrained. There was physical distancing and a lot of contact tracing through advanced pass use. What we saw at level 1 was the capacity constraints disappeared, which is fantastic. Social distancing actually disappeared as well, because at that point we got to the eradication point with COVID. And with that shift from level 2 to level 1, so the only constraint at this point is that the international borders were shut, so no tourists internationally coming into the country. We saw around about a 15% boost for visitor attractions here. So I think that's a really interesting data point for other countries that are pursuing eradication of when they might get to fully reopen, what that might look like. And also for those who are wondering how much they're missing out on because there is still COVID in their communities. That's sort of the best of what you would have seen otherwise. The interesting point is it's not 100%. It doesn't give you, even if you didn't have any tourist exposure, it doesn't take you completely back to normal. There is still a reduction. People are still hesitant, even in a safe place, to get out and go to visitor attractions after being in lockdown for so long.
And we're a big fan of the numbers. We're a big fan of the data. So what have we learned from our recovery index?
Yeah, I think we launched a scenario simulation tool in our product a few months back, and it is a free tool, so any visitor attraction anywhere in the world can sign up and use it. And so we do see what scenarios everybody is planning for, and I think what we've learned is that those scenarios were on the whole quite optimistic. And what we would suggest if you are scenario planning now is to at least have that probable case. We suggest always having a best, worst and most probable case. So that probable case should be sitting around the 20% mark with a slow growth. We saw a lot of scenarios being simulated of pent-up demand, of sort of maybe we'll get 75% of normal, and that's simply not the case anywhere. So if you have done some scenario planning and you've got those ones, maybe sort of push them to one side, replan your scenarios, be quite pessimistic in doing it. If you have reopened already and you're sitting at that 20-30% mark, I think it's worthwhile continuing to do scenario planning of how that recovery will unfold. And again, try and be a little bit on the safer side of some of those assumptions that you're making of how quickly those markets will come back, even just in your local market.
And although we're talking about rejigging plans and being a little bit more pessimistic, I think it is still important for us to remind you all to celebrate the small wins.
Those visitors coming through the door. The day that you reopen, I mean, it's a fantastic milestone. I know that the numbers won't quite be what everybody hopes them to be, but the very fact that we can is a sign of recovery. And I think it's a moment to be celebrated when those visitors come through the door for the first time. Clap them in, really celebrate each goal with the team. If you go from having 100 visitors a day to 200 visitors a day, that's growth to celebrate. If you double down on the next week, fantastic. And just keep on reminding the team that every step is a step in the right direction.
And I think also after Angie and I have visited all the attractions that we have here in New Zealand, and in some cases visiting on the first day of their reopening, your visitors are celebrating with you as well. And we were so happy to see a lot of attractions being able to reopen. So don't think you're the only ones celebrating, because your visitors are doing that with you too. So for people who are interested in benchmarking their attractions reopening data, with our reopening index and the data that we know, how can they learn more?
Yeah, so this has been such a useful guide, I think, for the venues that we've been working with to know, is what I'm experiencing normal? We've decided to invest in it. We'll be pulling out more of this benchmark to share with you all. We'll make a series of it available free in the simulation tool, and then of course for Dexibit premium customers, there'll be more benchmarking available to you as well through the product. So do keep your eyes peeled. I think tracking everyone's performance against that benchmark as recovery occurs will be a wonderful way of sort of pacing ourselves through that recovery. And really learning together as an industry. So if you are out there using the simulation tool, get uploading with your data as soon as you reopen. If you haven't signed up already, it's not too late to do so. Scenario planning, really useful. If you haven't reopened, really useful to continue to do while the future is uncertain. And then these benefits of accessing benchmark and other analysis to help you track your recovery. It's a great tool, it's free, so Dexibit.com is the place to go.
Details down here. But that's it for our session today. Thank you so much for joining us on our Reopening Benchmarks chat. If you have any questions, please get in touch with us. But otherwise, thank you so much, and we'll see you on our next live session.
Good luck for the recovery. Bye, everyone.
Bye.